Are Catholics too legalistic? I recently read this article about a Detroit man who thought he was a priest, who had been living as a priest, but as it turns out, he wasn't. It almost seemed like clickbait, right? Like he was this sinister man that duped all of these people for so many years. But this story might actually surprise you, and I think it can teach us a very valuable lesson that us as Catholics need to learn. Welcome to All That Catholic Stuff. I'm Chris Bray. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe on YouTube and click the bell to be notified when I post new videos. Father Matthew Hood of the Archdiocese of Detroit thought he was ordained a priest in 2017. But as it turns out, his ordination wasn't valid because he wasn't validly baptized as a baby. He learned this by accident as he was watching a home video of his own baptism. He heard the words of the deacon who baptized him say, "We baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit." Now, the correct form, the correct words that are required to be said in order for baptism to be valid is, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit." Now this might come as a surprise for you, but by not using the correct prescribed language that the church gives to us, the sacrament is not valid. See, priests can't just say whatever they want. And in this case, because the form was not correct, he was not validly baptized. Therefore, everything else which is dependent upon baptism was also invalid, such as his confirmation, such as his ordination to the priesthood. It'd be kind of like baptizing someone with chocolate milk. Like, maybe you even had the right intention, but because it was incorrect form, the sacrament is invalid. I will be completely honest with you. When I read this story in its entirety, and I absorbed it for a couple of minutes, like my soul was screaming, legalism! Pharisee! Like, it just bothered me so much. Like, how can we as a church be so narrow-minded and so legalistic that obviously this wasn't done in maliciousness? Like, he gave his life to the priestly service and he thought he was honestly baptized. He thought that he was validly ordained a priest. How can we be so legalistic that we reduce God to be bound by these words prescribed to us by the church? This is what was going on in my mind after I first read this article. I was so frustrated with this because I've seen legalism take place in the church before, where we put outward disposition above our hearts in the sincerity of it, in the intention of it. And it drives me nuts and it frustrates me, probably because I struggled with this for so many years. Like, I was thinking to myself, okay, I know the church has domain over this, but legalism, Pharisee, right? That's what was going on in my mind. Like, this was obviously not something that Father Hood had intentionally done. Like, he was a baby, he was an infant. He did not merit the baptism and therefore did not merit the baptism was done in incorrect form. It wasn't his fault. Like, I was thinking, like, we don't need any more legalism in our church today. We need people who approach the sacraments with this sincerity and authenticity, like with an open heart towards God, that they want to just pour their whole heart out to God without reservation, and they don't care whether they're making the sign of the cross from the right to left instead of left to right. All they care for is that they just want to pour their heart out to Jesus. That's what we need in the church today. Like, on a certain level, after initially reading this article, it kind of reminded me of these fence laws that Jews used to have. They would create these laws surrounding the other bigger laws so that they didn't break the big laws. They would have other laws around them that they also couldn't break. It would be like a safety mechanism, you know, like as a backup. Like, to make sure you don't break this one law, we're going to put a fence law around it so that you don't break that either. And it just reminded me of like these unnecessary laws and restrictions and these things that are bound up that we put in place, that we burden people with. This was where my mind was at when I was reading this article. I would suggest that to some degree we should feel this way. Like, I don't know about you, but I'm done with like all of the legalism in the church, with all of the going through the motions, with all of this like void and empty ritualistic ceremonial mentality that's so often that we have, because our hearts and our minds, there's this disconnect. And that the things that we do so often, they're more so an outward appearance rather than coming from the heart, from us towards God and his people. Like, I'm so sick of that. I'm done with that. I want God to like penetrate my heart and change me from within. And I'm sorry, God, if I mess up the form, if I make the sign of the cross from right to left instead of left to right, like, God, I want my heart to be in the right place before I want my form to be correct. If that bothers us, it should a little bit to some degree. I think that's okay. I think we should be longing for sincerity and for authenticity first. However, wrapped up in this news article that bothered me so much, I think there are two hard truths and very important things for us as Catholics to learn. Number one, the church has been given the authority to bind us to these prescriptions. See, this isn't even something new, right? This is a continuation of the authority of God that was given to the Jews that even Jesus recognized in the Gospel of Matthew. He said, be careful to do what the scribes and the Pharisees do, because they sit in Moses' seat of authority, right? Like Moses had the ability to bind and loose. And Jesus, when criticizing the scribes and the Pharisees, he says they bind up heavy burdens, but don't lift a finger to loose them. But he said, be very careful to do what they tell you. Why? Because they had the authority to do so. This authority was given to them by God. And we see this as a continuation in the New Testament as well. We see that Jesus says to his apostles, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loose in heaven. The church has been given the authority to bind these prescriptions to us. And so we have to be obedient to them because it's the authority of God. Like, for example, in the Old Testament, if you were not circumcised, you were not part of the covenant of God, and therefore you were not allowed to participate in the Passover sacrifice. No matter how hard you tried, no matter how beautiful you thought the ritual and the ceremony was, you could not partake at the table and consume the lamb unless you were circumcised. And in a similar way, Father Hood, no matter how much he wanted to become a priest, no matter how much he thought he was a priest, could not be validly ordained to the priesthood because he was not technically part of the covenant of God. He wasn't baptized validly. As St. Paul reminds us in the New Testament, that baptism is the new circumcision. This is how we are made part of God's new covenant. Here's the reality, that God is not bound to the sacraments or even to the prescribed language of the church, but we are. God is not bound by the sacraments. We are. The second and probably most important lesson that we can learn from this is a lesson of humility and obedience. See, Father Hood probably wasn't pleased to discover that his baptism was performed with the incorrect form, right? He probably wasn't too happy to discover that his baptism was not valid, therefore his ordination wasn't valid. And I'm pretty sure that the Archdiocese of Detroit probably didn't really like having to pursue this. Probably did not want the publicity, the negative feedback that they would get from this. But here's the thing, is that they, in obedience and humility, pursued the truth of this matter because it reminds us that we are to do the same. That God isn't bound by the sacraments, but we are. And we're called to be humble and obedient to what God has commanded us. See, this humble obedience was demonstrated by Father Hood as he pursued to resolve these issues with his baptism, with his ordination. The Archdiocese of Detroit showed their transparency and their humility to be able to resolve these matters. And it's a reminder for us that though things might be difficult, and though we may not prefer it, and though that sometimes it's difficult for what's in the darkness to be brought out into light, that this humble obedience is what we're called to. To be disciples of Jesus is to leave everything behind, to trust in his commands, to trust the church that he established and set into motion and gave his authority to, because the church exists for us to be able to make it to our eternal destination of heaven. See, this is the humble obedience that each of us is to strive for. See, here's the thing, maybe we don't fully appreciate why the prescribed language is so essential to the validity of the sacraments. Maybe we just have this mentality where we think of it as a silly, legalistic semantic. But the real test of our faith is if we, though we may not understand it, though we may not recognize the significance of it, are we still willing to submit ourselves to the seat of Moses' authority, which has been given to the apostles? Are we willing to humble ourselves and be obedient to that, even though we may not understand it? That's the test of our faith. That is what we are called to. And here's the thing, if we're not, then maybe the legalism and the hypocrisy isn't out there somewhere, but maybe it's in here. What are your thoughts on the situation with Father Hood's priestly ordination and the validity of his baptism? Make sure you let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe on YouTube and click the bell to be notified when I post new videos. Lastly, I'd be so grateful if you would consider supporting my ministry work. Provide talks and music and faith resources, and you can get all the details when you go to patreon.com/chrisbray. Thanks so much, and God bless you.
Let your grace